Every empire swears its money is safe, every government insists its promises will last forever, and every time history proves them wrong. From Rome to France, from the Confederacy to modern Lebanon, people have woken up to find their savings worthless, their salaries meaningless, and their futures stolen by systems they thought were solid. Collapse isn't rare, collapse is the rule. The real question isn't whether financial systems fail, it's how you protect yourself when they do. The illusion of permanence is the most dangerous financial mistake of all. We look at our bank balances, our national currencies, and we assume they are bedrock, but money is not bedrock. It is trust, and trust can vanish overnight. That's why history is so brutal and so useful. Every collapse leaves behind a trail of lessons, patterns, and warnings about what actually protects wealth and what evaporates into dust. And if you pay attention, you'll see that the survivors of these disasters weren't the ones who trusted most. They were the ones who doubted first. Take the Byzantine Empire, often remembered as the eastern half of Rome that somehow survived 1,000 years after the Western Empire fell. At the heart of its economy was the gold solidus, a coin so reliable that merchants across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia accepted it without question. For centuries it was the closest thing the medieval world had to a global reserve currency. But here's the part loyal viewers will appreciate. You'd think they would have learned from Rome's earlier disaster with the silver denarius, when emperors kept debasing it until it was basically tin with a silver wash. We've told that story before, but no, centuries later the Byzantines made the same mistake. In gold they began shaving its purity, stretching it thinner, mixing in cheaper alloys. At first no one noticed, then trust cracked. The coin that had anchored Mediterranean trade became just another piece of political fiction. Debasement destroyed its credibility, and with it the Byzantine economy lost the stability it had once enjoyed. What survived? Not paper promises, not government decrees. Merchants who had quietly hoarded real gold or land outside imperial reach preserved wealth while everyone else saw their money evaporate. That's the first timeless lesson. Governments cannot resist the temptation to dilute their money, and when they do, real value flees to assets they cannot counterfeit. But not every collapse comes from rulers tinkering with coins. Sometimes it comes from shocks that strike out of nowhere. In the mid-14th century, Europe was struck by the most devastating pandemic in its history, the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, as many as half of all Europeans died. Cities emptied, villages vanished, trade routes broke down, and yet the economic story of the plague is more complex than simple catastrophe, because when half the labor force disappears, labor becomes precious. Survivors could demand higher wages. Food and land, once scarce, became relatively abundant compared to people. Families with liquidity, silver goods, or even just the ability to work suddenly had leverage they'd never dreamed of. Land that once cost a fortune could be bought for a fraction. Houses stood abandoned, fields unplowed. The survivors were in a buyer market. If that sounds uncomfortably familiar, it should. During the COVID pandemic we saw a modern version of this. Supply chains disrupted, governments printing trillions to keep the machine from seizing up, and a wave of inequality as those with liquidity bought assets while those living paycheck to paycheck slipped behind. In the United States, housing prices soared, stock markets recovered almost instantly while millions of ordinary people scrambled to cover rent. The rhyme is clear: pandemics redistribute wealth, they always have. Survivors of the Black Death leveraged scarcity to climb the social ladder. Survivors of COVID with liquidity scooped up property, stocks, and businesses that others could no longer hold. The lesson is not comforting, but it is true. Crises reward those with reserves and punish those without them. And while pandemics show us how fast shocks can flip an economy, the collapse of banking and Renaissance Florence shows us something just as vital: institutions that look too big to fail can fall like dominoes. In the 1340s, Florence was Europe's financial capital. Home to powerful banking families like the Bardi and Peruzzi, these houses had lent heavily to kings, most disastrously to Edward III of England, who defaulted on enormous loans during his wars with France. When Edward stopped paying, the banks collapsed, depositors were ruined, trade froze. Florence, once rich and powerful, was thrown into turmoil. The ordinary citizen who had trusted the city's mighty banking dynasties discovered that size was not safety and reputation was not protection. What did people learn? That too big to fail is a lie as old as finance itself. Institutions exist to profit, not to guarantee your survival. When they fall, they will take your savings with them. The lesson repeats in every century, from the Florentine crash to Lehman Brothers in 2008 to the banks of Lebanon freezing accounts in 2019. Survival belongs to those who recognize that an institution's promises are only good until the day they aren't. The American Civil War is remembered for its battles, its politics, and the abolition of slavery, but behind the gunpowder in speeches was a brutal financial war that most Americans today barely understand. The Union and the Confederacy both discovered that war on that scale required printing money. In the North, the government issued greenbacks, paper currency not backed by gold but by the promise of the United States itself. At first the experiment seemed bold and patriotic, but the more greenbacks that flooded the economy, the less they bought. Inflation eroded their value and trust wavered. In the South the problem was even worse. The Confederacy, desperate for resources, printed graybacks in staggering quantities. By the end of the war, Confederate inflation had reached almost unimaginable levels, prices rising thousands of percent, salaries buying almost nothing, soldiers' paychecks were worthless before they could even spend them. Families carried bags of bills that could barely buy a loaf of bread. By 1865, Confederate currency was not just weak, it was dead. What mattered in that collapse was not paper promises but hard assets, land, food, gold, anything real held value. While money became a cruel joke for ordinary Southerners, this was devastating. Lifelong savings vanished into dust. For opportunists with access to tangible goods, the war was a chance to seize property and wealth at fire sale prices. It is a lesson Americans rarely hear but should never forget. Your own country has already lived through a currency collapse, and when it happened, protection came not from trusting the paper in your wallet but from holding value the system could not inflate away. France too offers a brutal case study in how revolutions can destroy money faster than any war. In the 1790s, as revolutionaries toppled the monarchy and seized churchlands, they issued a new paper currency, the assignats, backed in theory by the value of confiscated property. These notes were supposed to stabilize the economy. Instead, the government printed them with abandon. Each new issue diluted the last, prices spiraled upward, wages failed to keep pace, and soon the assignat became worthless. Farmers refused to sell food for paper, demanding goods or silver instead. In Paris, the bread riots returned and the revolution devoured itself. The winners in this collapse weren't the ones holding patriotic paper, they were the ones who held food, gold, or property, things the government couldn't print. For the ordinary Parisian, the lesson came too late. Promises, no matter how noble, are only worth what others will accept. When the trust breaks, your savings don't just shrink, they vanish. Fast forward 2 centuries and the lesson reappears in Asia. In 1997, what began as a speculative attack on the Thai baht spiraled into a regional crisis. Thailand had borrowed heavily in dollars, confident that its currency peg would hold, but when it collapsed, debts in foreign currency became unpayable. Overnight, investors fled. Currencies across Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, South Korea collapsed in a chain reaction. Economies shrank, unemployment soared, governments begged the International Monetary Fund for rescue. The people who suffered most were not the global hedge funds who sparked the panic, it was ordinary citizens whose savings lost value, whose mortgages doubled in cost, whose jobs evaporated. And yet the pattern was painfully familiar. Those who held dollars or assets abroad survived better than those who trusted local currency. Nations dependent on foreign debt were forced into austerity while Wall Street institutions walked away with fire sale deals on Asian assets. What looked like a local collapse was in truth a global transfer of wealth. The lesson echoes every collapse from Byzantium to Argentina. Debt in someone else's money is a death trap. When the storm hits, it isn't the creditor who drowns, it's the debtor. By now the picture should be clear. Whether it is revolutionary France, Civil War America, or modern Asia, the same themes repeat. Paper money collapses, debt chains nations and families. And those who survive are never the ones who trust most in the system but the ones who recognize its fragility before it cracks. The most chilling part of history is that collapse isn't just ancient or distant, it's happening now in Lebanon. Between 2019 and 2021, the banks did something that still feels unthinkable to most people in the developed world. They locked the doors. Citizens woke up to find their deposits frozen, withdrawals limited, and their currency collapsing. The Lebanese pound lost over 90 of its value. A lifetime of savings became pocket change. People lined up outside banks begging for access to their own money only to be told it was gone. And it wasn't just small savers, middle-class families, retirees, doctors and engineers, anyone who had trusted the system. We were wiped out. The lesson was brutal and clear. Your money in the bank is not a treasure chest, it is a loan you've made to an institution that can decide in a crisis not to pay you back. The people who survived best were those who had either diversified abroad, held real assets like gold or property, or kept cash outside the banking system. Everyone else was trapped. If this sounds far away, it should. In 2008, Americans watched their homes repossessed and their pensions decimated while banks that caused the crisis were bailed out. In 2020, during the pandemic, trillions were printed to keep the machine alive, a lifeline that inflated asset prices for the wealthy while leaving ordinary wages stagnant. In 2023, regional banks in the United States collapsed almost overnight when depositors lost confidence, reminding everyone that the safety of too big to fail is a fairy tale we like to tell ourselves until the day the door slams shut. So how do you protect yourself when everything falls apart? History shows there is no single answer. In Byzantium it was gold after the Black Death, it was liquidity to buy abandoned land. In Florence it was not trusting too big to fail bankers. In the Confederacy it was hard goods. In France it was food and property. In Asia it was avoiding debt in someone else's currency. In Lebanon it was getting out of the banks before they closed their doors. The patterns change, but the theme is constant. Survival comes not from blind trust in paper or institutions, but from recognizing what holds real value when illusions collapse. And here is the paradox that should wake you up: collapse is both a tragedy and an opportunity. For the unprepared it is ruin, but for those with resilience, liquidity, or assets that cannot be printed away, it is the moment to acquire wealth at a fraction of its former cost. After the Black Death, peasants became landowners because there was too much land and not enough people to farm it. After 2008, those with cash bought homes while millions were foreclosed. History shows us that protection is not just about defense, it is also about positioning yourself to seize what others under pressure are forced to give up. But wealth isn't only about what you own, it is also about what you can do. The survivors of history weren't just those who had gold or property, they were those who could create value when others could not. The baker who could still provide bread, the craftsman who could repair tools, the farmer who could feed a community, the merchant who could move goods across borders. These were the people who didn't just survive collapses, they rose in them. In every crisis, money loses meaning, but production never does. People still need to eat, to build, to trade, to live. And those who can meet those needs are never poor for long. That's the deeper protection, not blind faith in institutions, not the hope that governments or banks will save you, but the combination of real assets, real skills, and the awareness that illusions always collapse. Every crisis is a transfer. From the many who trusted to the few who prepared, from paper promises to tangible value, from passive savers to active builders. History has shown this pattern again and again. So the question is not whether everything falls apart, it always does. The question is whether you will be one of the many left holding promises or one of the few holding something real. History doesn't repeat, but